to each of you. Thank you. It's April 15th. I've been sent by Washington to make you feel better somehow about your taxes. And I can see it's not working very well. I've also been sent by Washington to make you feel better about the current political situation. And I can see that's not working very well. I always look forward, as I'm sure many of you do, to the notifications that come out from this society periodically, put together by Don Huntley here, because he does such a fine job of finding the appropriate art. And when the last one came out, my wife said, well, at last they found a good likeness of you. And I said, that's Agamemnon. He's been dead 3,000 years. And she said, that's what I mean. So, actually, the only thing that's changed about Washington since I moved there is they've legalized pot, though I must confess I had nothing to do with that whatsoever. So, 103 years ago, Jung asked a peculiar question, a question that would occur to someone like Jung. What is my myth? And he concluded he had no idea what the answer was. He knew it wasn't his father's. His father was one of 6 clergymen whom Jung was a relative to whom. It was not his mother, who was interested in other occult sources of wisdom, although Jung shared some interest there too as well. And when we ask the question of ourselves, what is my myth? Does that question make any sense at all? What does it mean to us? And I'd like to try to clarify why that question might be of extreme importance to each of us tonight, and then to try to give you more illustrations tomorrow in our workshop. Because we are a creature who suffers the loss of meaning. We're thrown into a life that is querulous and perilous and ends in our mortality. And along the way, it's important for each of us to try to figure out what it's about. And it begins the moment we begin to struggle with consciousness itself. Why am I here? What's going on here? What do I need to know? How am I supposed to comport myself? Who are you? What are the transactions going on between us? What can I expect from this world? These elemental questions are being asked in a profoundly critical way. And of course, provisional answers, interpretations, stories, if you will, are arising out of that experience. We experience the world phenomenologically. That is to say, we're not thinking it, we're experiencing it, but that experience then gets storied. If I can turn a noun, story, into a verb, it gets storied. And we all live these stories. If we could somehow X-ray ourselves spiritually and psychologically, we would see streams of stories running through us. We could see streams of stories running through our culture and through our history out here. And what are those streams of stories? Do they make sense of our life? Do they answer those questions? Because those are the questions we still have. And at times we have to wonder, is the story or stories I'm living make any sense at all? Is it an absurdist drama? Is it something that I've had a choice over? Is it something driven by people and forces outside of myself? That's the metaphor that the poet Denisha Lameras wrestled with in a poem called Fictional Characters. Imagine with her that we were all part of a novel, and for a moment we could walk out of that novel, out of this provisional life that we have, into something else. What would we be then? Fictional characters. Do they ever want to escape, climb out of the white pages and enter our world? Holden Caulfield slipping in the movie theater to catch the 2 o'clock. Anya Karenina sitting at the OK Diner, reading the newspaper as the waitress serves up a cheeseburger. Even Hector, on break from the Iliad, takes a stroll through the park, admiring the tulips. Maybe they grew tired of the author's mind, of its twists and turns. Or were finally weary of stumbling around Pamplona, bottle in each fist, eating lotuses on the banks of the Nile. For others, it was just too hot in the small California town where they'd been written into a lifetime of plowing fields. Whatever the reason, here they are, roaming the city streets, rain falling on their phantasmal shoulders. Wouldn't you, if you could, step out of your own story, to lean against the doorway of the Five and Dime, sipping your coffee, your life somewhere far behind you, all its heat and toil nothing but a tale resting in the hands of a stranger, and the sidewalk ahead of you wet and glistening? So when we reflect on the nature of the personal myth, I always remember the suggestion by the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who said, and I quote, "This is not a matter of how we think in myths, but how myths operate in our minds without our being aware of the fact." Putting it more literally, myths think us. The stories think us. The stories govern our lives. They create the patterns. They create these influences that ripple through the lives of our children into the patterns of history. And again, how do they even generate? And in every moment of our life, there's a kind of phenomenological experience going on. It's like the primal experience is storied. How do I understand that? What's my role here? How do I cope? How do I manage? How do I adjust? How do I get my needs met? How do I manage my anxiety? And we realize we're trying to read chaos, if you will. Life may have no inherent meaning, but we are creatures who wish to impose upon it pattern, order, sequence, predictability, meaning, and we suffer the disconnect from that. And so we have some stories that are overt, stories that pass down from parent to child. Some stories are part of our tribal traditions. Some of the stories course through us unconsciously as complexes, for example. Some stories are playing out at a very deep level, the archetypal field, our DNA, our genetic patterns. Those are stories unfolding too, of which we're by and large unaware. And in so many ways, we're sort of creating a kind of narrative along the way as we try to make sense of our lives. And many times our stories are provisional, based on that time, that place, our way of seeing at that moment, but we can get stuck in our stories. Sometimes one of the ways to think about therapy in the second half of life is bringing the stories to the surface that we've been living. Maybe the stories that have gotten us into trouble, that sabotaged a relationship or caused a depression, or the stories that we've been serving that are no longer worthy of the soul's intent. And in those moments, we realize another story perhaps is wishing to be born through us, but we have very little sense of its outline or its intention at that moment. And so the storying goes on continuously. And many times the prejudicial nature of that story means what appeared to be true of that time and that place often gets extrapolated into other times and places so that we become prisoners of those stories. I think it was the last time I was here, or maybe it was 2 times before, we were talking about the metaphor of hauntings. And we were talking about how, as Faulkner said in Requiem for a Nun, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. That the stories that we have in a culture, or the stories we have intrapsychically, continue to exercise a particular power, especially as they're operating unconsciously. And here's an example of someone wrestling with stories, and it's by Peter Everwine. And it's titled, "A Story Can Change Your Life." On the morning she became a young widow, my grandmother, startled by a sudden shadow, looked up from her work to see a hawk turn her prized rooster into a cloud of feathers. That same moment, halfway around the world in a Minnesota mine, her husband died, buried under a ton of rockfall. She told me this story 60 years ago. I don't know if it's true, but it ought to be. She was a hard old woman, and though she knelt on Sundays when the acolyte's silver bell announced the moment of Christ's miracle, it was the darker mysteries she lived by. Shiver cry of an owl, black dog by the roadside, a tapping at the door and no one there. The moral of the story was plain enough. Miracles become a burden and require a priest to explain them. With signs, you only need to keep your wits about you and place your trust in a shadow world that lets you know hard luck and grief are coming your way. And for that, as the story goes, any day will do. Well, the word myth, interestingly enough, unfortunately has been debased in contemporary times, as has the word a tragedy and a few other great ideas, but it comes from an etymological root that ironically means to squint. Strange origin, to squint. It's as if the best we ever get is a tiny aperture into the larger phenomenon, a small point of reference, an entree into a larger reality. So myth, metaphor, and symbol are the tools our human animal has to try to approach the essential mystery of being human. And we have words like mystery, mysticism, mum's the word, even myopia, which means squinty eye, by the way. These are words all related to the same original etymological root, to squint. And when we think about myth as force fields of energy that have the power to influence us, whether consciously or not, we begin to see how does this operate in daily life. This is not an abstract academic concept. This is something very practical and very real. And I want to just suggest 3 areas in which myth plays out in our lives. First, as tribal value systems. Secondly, as personal scenarios in the context of family life. And then thirdly, as our intrapsychic dynamics going on a very personal level. So in the first example, the sort of tribal values, what moves our tribe? If for a moment we think about this enormously diverse culture that we have on this continent, by and large, it's a set of secular ideas that may or may not be endorsed consciously, but actually motivate and move people's lives. Just go out on the highway on Monday morning, or any day actually on the highway, as we found this afternoon coming from the airport. And what about this mobilization of humanity? It's in service to those mythological forces of energy. The great mythological systems of modern and postmodern culture, of course, are materialism, the fantasy that the good life is found through the acquisition of material things. The more so as one feels less and less connected to the invisible world. You know, the more the linkages of tribal mythological systems that once connected people to the gods and to the powers of nature and to the invisible world, the more it's replaced with tangible objects of desire. Or secondly, hedonism, the search for pleasure, the search for sensate distraction. We live in an electronic world which is geared to overload, sensory overload, and sensory stimulation. And of course, narcissism in a world of selfies is all about me. It's not about community. It's not about the tribe anymore. And we're driven by love, power, wealth. You know, these are the prevailing ideologies that actually move the masses of humanity. The poet Edward Hirsch has written about this in a poem he titled Mergers and Acquisitions. And this came out around 95, but it's still quite applicable. Beyond junk bonds and oil spills, beyond the collapse of savings and loans, beyond liquidations and options on futures, beyond basket trading and expanding foreign markets, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the Standard & Poor's Stock Index, mutual funds, commodities, beyond the rising tide of debits and credits, opinion polls, falling currencies, the signs for LA Gear and Coca-Cola Classic, the signs for U.S. Steel and General Motors, high-grade copper, municipal bonds, domestic sugar, beyond FACT and collateral buildups, beyond mergers and acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, beyond the official policy on inflation and the consensus on happiness, beyond the national trends in buying and selling, getting and spending, the market stalled and the cost passed on to consumers, beyond the statistical charts on prices, there is something else that drives us. Some rage or hunger, some absence smoldering like a childhood fever, vaguely remembered or half perceived, some unprotected desire, or a greed, both wound and knife, a failed grief, a lost radiance. Well, you get the sense there that he's reading the culture and seeing beneath the activity an enormous psycho-spiritual hunger. Myth functions as the kind of scenario, assignment, if you will, that we get rising out of families of origin. One child, every child reads the atmosphere and says, again, what's the message here and what am I supposed to do? We develop, as the British psychiatrist Winnicott called it, the false self, meaning simply adaptive rather than natural, and necessarily so. An assemblage of behaviors, attitudes, reflexive responses, whose purpose is to meet our emotional needs as best we can and manage anxiety and stay out of harm's way to the best that we can. And so one child learns, I am to carry the weight of the unlived, unconscious life in this particular setting, and that child is a scapegoat. Another one becomes the chronic helper and gets so identified with that, it comes at the long-term neglect of his or her own well-being. You can see it decades later. Or the chronically unseen, the person who is afraid to ask or search for whatever he or she may wish. The one who diverts the attention, the one who sort of removes the tension from the setting. Or if you're really troubled, the one who becomes the fixer, the nurse or the therapist, who has to try to fix everybody. People pick up a script. And as long as that story is operative within, and you can see often in the same family, same parents, same Cheerios, the same television programs, etc., and yet children going off in quite different directions, because each has in some way storied the dynamics in a quite different way, and then become in some way prisoners of that story. However provisional that story may be, we tend to ride with that which has been our first understandings of self and world. Or thirdly, myth as a psychodynamic image at work within us. An obvious example of that is our dream life. Every night, on an average, we produce at least 6 dreams, according to sleep researchers, on a normal sleep cycle. Enormous, nature doesn't seem to waste energy. It's probably, processing our lives and commenting upon it. And those commentaries, as Jung and many others have pointed out, have been profoundly important to anyone who wishes to understand that there is another story that's challenging the many provisional stories that our ego consciousness is in service to in any given day. There are stories unfolding in our bodies. We tend to think of our bodies as objective others in some way, but our bodies and our psyches are one and the same, of course. And so the body carries those stories too, as body workers know, and psychosomatic medicine tells us. Our behavioral patterns tell us, of course, too. As I pointed out in a previous visit, we don't rise in the morning and say, today I'm going to do the same stupid counterproductive things I've done for, a long time, but we do. And of course, what we recognize there is that there are driving forces, aka complexes, that are, when triggered, producing routinized behavior, and that behavior then produces the outcome, the concretization called a pattern. And we can take those patterns and work backwards. And frankly, we don't challenge those patterns until they begin to cause consequences. They produce conflict in our relationships. They cause a depression. They produce an addiction as a way of self-medicating the conflict within, whatever the course may be. It brings us to some kind of accountability, because even when we've done all the right things, we realize something inside is not cooperating. I don't know if you were aware, but there's a whole bunch of little people down inside there. And, you know, the executive office suite up here doesn't pay much attention down there, but every once in a while those people revolt. And it's when they revolt that life gets very sticky. And it's in those moments that one is obliged to then begin to examine what is it that I'm having to look at here. That's why Jung famously said once, encounters with the self are typically felt as defeats for the ego. Why would it be a defeat for the ego if unless the ego is invested in the fantasy that I know who I am, I'm in charge, and I'm making proper decisions? And, you know, it's an understandable fantasy, but it is that, a fantasy, and it's frequently undermined by the reality of the external world, number one, and number two, the contrary agendas of the little people downstairs. So the complexes, in a sense, are triggered by anything in the outer world that in some way activates our history. We are historic creatures. And when that gets triggered, we realize what comes up for us is the history. It's almost as if when our history is triggered, whether we know it or not, a pair of lenses comes over our eyes, lenses ground long ago and far away, and we see the other, or we see the situation through the lens of that time and that place. And as so many of those core or central complexes were generated so long ago in disempowered times in our development, often our responses are regressive in character. They completely ignore the person who's grown up in the meantime, the resilient adult capable of other kinds of possible choices, behaviors, resilience, etc., which is one reason why the old cliche that I become an enemy to myself or I'm my own worst opponent is such a truth, because we realize I keep stumbling over myself in the course of my life. And that's the beginning of wisdom, at least, to recognize that. You know you have a problem when you have a person always saying, I keep stumbling over myself, but it's your fault, you see. That's when that person's still lodged in the fantasy of the executive suite, that it knows everything that's going on. Now, to give you an example of the triggering of a complex, which is also, at the moment, an insight and a summons to accountability. And it begins with a very sort of common tourist moment, a person visiting Greenwich, England, where the international time zone begins. The international dateline is there, and simply called Greenwich by Kirsten Deerking. At the Naval Museum, I look at Nelson's uniform, the one he was wearing the day he was killed at Trafalgar. And the bullet's damage to the blue coat is surprisingly slight. Just before he died, he said, "Thank God I have done my duty." He must have been a little afraid of not being able to do the heroic work required of him. It's a lovely day in March. The sun and daffodils are out. We walk to the observatory, straddle the prime meridian, try to feel our blood flowing back and forth between hemispheres. There's a lot of laughter, young people clowning around, adults striking silly poses for photographs, and why not? One day, won't we all have to be brave? Well, clearly what she's getting at there is that in that moment of one person's life, he was summoned to a value. And of course, it triggers in her stories, her various stories, and she necessarily asks the question, and could I possibly be true to whatever my values might be on such a moment as that? Now, our personal story, our neuroses, our journeys, all have to do with the kind of continuing sorting through our lives, our dreams, the debris of our histories, those moments where emotion floods us, those embarrassments, chagrins, or as the Brits say, chagrins, and those times when we wonder what hit me or why did I react that way. And those are the ways we begin to discern these fragmentary stories that work within each of us. Because early on in our life, as I mentioned, we're constantly interpreting. And even in infancy, at early childhood, we begin to program what I'll call elemental axes of value. Like, are you safe or unsafe? Are you approachable or should I stay away? Are you reliable or unreliable? Am I valued for myself as I am, or do I have to stay out of harm's way? Do I have to twist myself in some way to gain your favor? These very elemental survival questions get programmed as axes of value intrapsychically and form a kind of internal gyroscope that's spinning, and in time it becomes like a GPS. It helps orient us in our relationships to others. And yet we realize how provisional that early experience is and how prejudicial that experience becomes in relating to other people. So we could realize decades later my behavioral patterns, my comfort with others, my discomfort with them, the ways I deal with conflict, the ways I avoid conflict, the ways I give away my integrity all the time, etc., etc. Those have their origin long ago and far away. They've been so deeply buried, I haven't realized how provisional they are, how in a sense, sort of fictive they were. And say they're fictive is not to say they're untruth. The word fiction etymologically comes from a verb that means to make. So we have the word factory and fabric. And a fiction is a thing made. So these are constructs. And these internal values also can be positive, sustain us. So we know early on the infant and the child is interpreting its world in terms of what to expect from others and how to relate to them and whether it is of value. And it takes a lot of other qualifying experiences and a lot of other roads to travel to undo those experiences or supplement them or frankly to outgrow them. In fact, Jung said in a very helpful way, I think, we never solve those problems, but we can outgrow them. I say it's helpful because I've heard many people say through the years, in the context of therapy or personal life, I'm so upset with myself. I thought I was beyond a certain situation, behavior. It's like, well, it's very fundamental to one's early mode of adapting, let's say, or surviving. You don't solve it. You grow up around it, you know? And as he said, you outgrow it. It plays less and less a role in your life. You recover sooner. In time, it's less of a default position and shows up maybe only once in a while. Now, progress is not a linear thing. It's more of a spiral thing. And it doesn't help us to berate ourselves when we have those returns, as we will, to those places of the original story, because we invariably will. Now, we also have to recognize the power of some positive stories here. The fact that we're all here, relatively intact, and you found the right place and the right night is itself miraculous when you think about it. I mean, there are many people out there still looking for the meeting, and there are some who went to the Freudian meeting, so we can't help them, you know? So we always have to ask ourselves, you know, what are the stories within me? And just call them stories. That's a pretty neutral word. If you call them complex, it automatically almost gets pathologized. I'm using the word story here because it's a little more neutral. Which are the stories that support us, sustain us, give us a sense of worth, empower us? which are the ones that undermine us, make us doubt ourselves, even cause us avoidance and self-sabotage. Now, you notice tonight I'm not giving you clinical examples. I'm giving you poems, mostly, because they're story poems. What's the best way to illustrate this is through the universality of the arts. And so here's an example of a person with positive complexes, the poet Theodor Redke. Now, Theodor Redke's father happened to be the chief botanist and gardener for the House of Prussia in Königsberg back in the 19th century. And at the time of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, he immigrated from Prussia to Michigan, wanting to avoid conscription. And in time created the largest greenhouse in Michigan. It may still be, I don't know. I actually visited there a few decades ago, and it was still there at that time. So Theodor Redke grew up, literally, in a greenhouse, and spent his childhood in a greenhouse. And his parents had brought over a lot of the German ladies who worked with them to work in the greenhouse, and they became his surrogate parents too, his nursemaids and his companions of childhood. So he names this poem and dedicates it to three of them. And the poem's title is Frau Baumann, Frau Schmidt, and Frau Schwarze. Gone the three ancient ladies who creaked on the greenhouse ladders, reaching up white strings to wind the sweet pea tendrils, the smilax nasturtiums, the climbing roses, to straighten carnations, red chrysanthemums, the stiff stems jointed like corn. They tied and they tucked, these nurses of nobody else. Quicker than birds, they dipped up and down, sifted the dirt, they sprinkled and shook. They stood astride pipes, their skirts billowing out wide into tents, their hands twinkling with wet. Like witches, they flew along rows, keeping creation at ease. With a tendril for a needle, they sewed up the air with a stem. They teased out the seed that the cold kept asleep. All the coils, loops, and whorls, they trellised the sun. They plotted for more than themselves. I remember how they picked me up, a spindly kid, pinching and poking my thin ribs, till I lay in their laps laughing, weak as a whiffet. And now, when I'm alone and cold in my bed, they still hover over me, those ancient leathery crones with their bandanas stiffened with sweat and their thorn-bitten wrists, and their snuff-laden breath blowing lightly over me in my first sleep. That was from 1948. Lovely poem. Richard Hugo, who passed away a few years ago, wrote one about his childhood. And according to Richard Hugo, and according to this poem, he had an absolutely miserable childhood. However, in this poem, titled mysteriously, What Thou Lovest Well Remains American, he still extols it as his nurturant source, which makes you wonder about the rest of his life. Because as miserable as it was, it's still something that feeds the spirit. And you know, you can hear it for yourself. You remember, the name was Jensen. She seemed old, always alone inside. Face pasted gray to the window, and mail never came. 2 blocks down, the Grubskys went insane. George played rotten trombone. Easter when they flew the flag. Wild roses remind you that the roads were gravel and vacant lots were the rule. Our poverty was real, wallet and spirit, and each day slow as church. You remember threadbare church groups on the corner howling their faith at stars, and the violent holy rollers renting that barn for their annual violet sing, and the barn burned down when you came back from war. Knowing the people you knew then are dead, you try to believe these paved roads now are improved. The neighbors moved in while you were away, good-looking, their dogs well-fed. You still have need to remember the lots empty and thick with fern. Lawns well-trimmed remind you of the train your wife took one day forever, some far empty town, the odd name you never recall. The time, 6:23, the day, October 9th. The year remains a blur. You blame this neighborhood for your failure in some vague way. The Grubskys degraded you beyond repair. And you know you must play again and again Miss Jensen pale at her window, must hear the foul music over the good slide of traffic. You love them well and they remain, still with nothing to do, no money and no will. Love them and the gray that was their disease you carry for extra food, in case you're stranded in some odd empty town and need hungry lovers for friends, and need feel you are welcome in the secret club they have formed. Well, pretty tough club, isn't it? And yet, as Richard Hugos suggests, there are stories there. Stories that he carries in his blood and bones. Stories that have come to the surface in poems, more than the one we just heard. Stories that play out in behaviors. A lot of them were violently against himself. And we realize at the same time there's something there that he draws upon, because in it is the morrow of his life, of his tomorrow perhaps. We also realize that for all of us at some point in our life, and for many of us in very significant ways, we also experience what is called mythic disassociation. That is to say, the force fields of the culture, or of the family, or of whatever setting we're in, institution or whatever, is imposed upon the spirit of the person and is inimical or contrary to the well-being of that person. And you all probably remember, I remember very clearly thinking, something is wrong here. And I also quickly followed that up with the thought, but I'm just a kid, and what do I know? And they're the big people, and they seem to know. And I believed when I was going older that they would take me aside and explain it. I'm still waiting, by the way. And I'm quite serious about this, quite literal, when I say I thought maybe somebody would explain it to me. And they haven't. So it was mythic dissociation, or as I now understand it. That is to say, energy systems and stories that are not consonant with the topography of your own soul, with the terrain of your own spirit. And you suffer, and you're outnumbered. So what do? And some of that comes from the culture, like racism, genderism, discriminations of all kinds, socioeconomic, religious, etc. We live in culture battles all the time. These are pathologizing to the souls of people. We live with other people's complexes all the time. Freud may have begun family therapy many decades ago when he said usually the family system is dominated by its most troubled member, which makes sense. It's usually not the child, it's one of the parents. So everybody is exposed to the psychic atmosphere of whatever's going on there. So, we realize that, the sort of value systems that animated our ancestors and moved them through life. And of course, we have to remember, for most of our ancestors, life was, in the phrase of David Hume, nasty, brutish, and short. No one here wishes to romanticize that. And most of them believed that this world was a very short pause or antechamber before some kind of eternal life. And, there was a direct link to that eternal life through sacred tribal mythological systems and sacred institutions. And as those linkages have eroded over the past few centuries and been progressively replaced by, materialism, hedonism, and narcissism, and the social ideologies of the 19th centuries, then one realizes increasingly the deracination and dissociation that people feel. And you can hear it in the arts, of course. It's one thing to say, as Robert Burns says in the 1790s, my love is like a red, red rose. Forget that it's a cliche. You immediately understand the connection between his rapture in the beauty of the rose and his beloved. What are we to do with T.S. Eliot's, let us go then, you and I, while the evening is spread out like a patient etherized upon the table? Because he goes on to explore that place that's neither heaven nor hell, but the place where most of us live, which is this twilight zone of our own incapacities. Or he writes elsewhere, this is the broken jaw of our lost kingdoms. Or Alan Tate writes, we are the eyelids of defeated caves. Now I challenge you to interpret that, and yet you get a sense of what it means. We are the eyelids of defeated caves. You see, these are dislocated metaphors. If the others had a metaphysical grounding or a grounding in nature, the linkage is there. When these things are maloccluded, as it were, or dislocated, it speaks to the dislocations of our time. And what happens in the modern world, in the postmodern world of disconnect, and the deconstruction of values, and the inversion of the received hierarchy of values, the individual's been thrown back upon his or her own psychic life to address these questions directly. Jung put it very succinctly. He said, to be a modern, and he said this a century ago, to be a modern is not just to be alive and sucking air. It means to understand that the mythic responsibility, which is to say the meaning of the responsibility for meaning, is shifted from the tribe to the shoulders of the individual. There's a well-known Polish sociologist, Zygmunt Bauman, who has said today is characterized, in his phrase, by liquid modernity. Liquid modernity. In other words, the only thing we can expect today is change. Most obviously, what will be the new iPhone? What will it look like, right? What's the new pop phrase? What's the new craziness in Washington, et cetera, et cetera? It's like nothing is stable. The new thing, it's liquidity, so to speak. And the great cultural split and divide in our culture today is along this fault line. And I'll be very brief about this. This is not a political statement, it's a psychological statement. When I was a child, there was still some power in what I'll call fixities. Now, don't go look up fixity, you won't find it. That is to say, categories, constructs, thought to be ontologically, that is to say, in the nature of being itself, or divinely given, which is also ontological, so to speak, and have since been deconstructed all along the way. For example, it used to be clear what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a woman. There were clear rules of behavior, understandings of nature, expectations, etc., etc. Racial categories, sexual practices, sexual definitions, sexual values, ethnic definitions. Now think about that in terms of Bauman's phrase, liquid modernity. And all of those fixities have been deconstructed. And we realize that their origin has come from the human ego's need to create order because it's terrified of disorder. There is that in each of us. That the only portion of the religious spectrum that has grown since World War II is fundamentalism in North America. And it's the recovery of the good old days because what? It reconstitutes the fixities, at least in the minds of the adherent. And more people slip away in terms of the general population. Hence the great anxiety that's generated by this ambivalence and by this ambiguity. So in a sense, this disquietude of our time is a time of the disintegration of great myths, if you will. And I'm not saying untruths. I'm saying great stories, remember. It's happened throughout history. 3,000 years ago, and I mentioned this on a previous visit, a terrible rumor swept the Mediterranean, and it caused panic. And the rumor was the great god Pan had died. You know, you think of Pan as a little goat guy, you know. Pan represented the linkage to the world of instinct. And it was being replaced by human culture, the Greco-Roman and Egyptian civilizations, and caused an enormous psychosocial civilization. In the 4th century of the Common Era, St. Augustine had to write a book, De Civitas Dei, the city of God, talking about the collapse of the social order and its meaning, to assure people that there is a provisional city, which is created by humans, and there's a divine city, which is eternal. He also wrote a treatise advising against suicide, because a lot of the early Christians thought, you know, this world is so untenable without that external order that let me get to this better life quickly. And so he had to write against that. Point being simply, when the story's foundations are shaky, or when there's a sense of ambiguity licking around one's heels, the ego gets very nervous and typically will respond by trying to reconstitute the story. And that's how you make America great again, you see. I mean, that's the appeal. That's exactly the point. It's a vision of something that didn't exist and no longer can exist, but it's very appealing. It has enormous psychological power. Now, to give you a couple examples, this is not a modern phenomenon. I'll give you 2 quick examples. In 1864, a poet from New Jersey was walking in the woods and noticed a spider spinning a web. And he, as disparate as that object was, he saw a kinship between himself and that insect. And he was watching this spider try again and again and again to weave its web. And this is what he wrote. A noiseless, patient spider, I noted, were on a little promontory. It stood isolated. Noted how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, surrounded in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. Well, that was Walt Whitman, you say. So the spider is extruding from its own core the filament to connect. And Whitman, in his way, too, is seeking to link to the spheres of meaning that has animated the past. 2 years before that, in a tiny village outside of Boston, in Amherst, Emily Dickinson writes an aphorism where she says, the sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can. And there's much to that story, which I can elaborate on in our question and answer period if you wish. But I think what she was saying there was, increasingly in our time, people are going to need to know they have a compass. And, you know, do we know we have a compass, and can we locate it? Can we trust it? Can we consult it? Especially as the outer map gets less and less defined, more and more murky. And to know that there is a compass, and that's sort of where Jung comes in too. Now, remember for a moment, let me check the time, remember for a moment that traditionally myth had 4 basic offices, namely to link us to the great orders of mystery. to the cosmos, to nature, to the tribe, and to oneself. To the cosmos, the word cosmos already is a Greek word meaning order. Its opposite is chaos. Is it an ordered universe? Well, who are the orderers? If so, who are the gods? What are their wills? What are we part of a larger story, a larger picture? And Jung writes in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I quote, "Meaning comes when people feel they're living the symbolic life, that they're actors in a divine drama. That gives the only meaning to human life. Everything else is banal, and you could dismiss it. A career, producing of children, all are maya or illusion compared to that one thing that your life is meaningful." So the question we all have to ask ourselves, do I feel any linkage in any way to the cosmos, to forces, powers larger than my own journey? And if so, what are the implications of that for the conduct of my life? And if not, what are the implications of that? That's a question I would submit to you is not out of fashion, because the question's being asked in the unconscious. If it's not asked unconsciously, or consciously rather, we'll be looking for it through our projections in the outer world. Looking for gurus out there, looking for all kinds of magic solutions, and so forth. The second order of mystery is, of course, to nature. We are natural creatures, and yet we progressively live in an artificial world, a so-called virtual reality, imposed on top of nature, often at its expense, and yet we remain natural creatures, born, yearning, and dying. So we have to ask ourselves, do I feel a link, a web, to the world around me? Or do I live predominantly cut off from that? And if so, where do I draw my sense of connection, again, to a natural order around me? And the third, of course, is to link to the tribe. Does that word mean anything to us? If so, who's your tribe? Where is your tribe? Is there such a thing today? At one level, we could say tribalism is the curse of the world. That's what produces so much violence and bloodshed. And yet, psychospiritually, a sense of belonging has always been part of the human story. So, who are your people? Do you feel a link to your ancestors? Feel supported by them? Do you feel a link to people around you? If you're alone, do you feel a link to some of the people that cross your path? One of the things I found with a lot of folks who come to Jungian programs is that many feel estranged from other organizations and feel shamed or isolated. And I've suggested that there is actually a community of exiles. You may not know it. They don't organize and run for office. Most of them are, by the way, pathological introverts like me, right? So you can hardly catch them out in public, but by the way, there is a community of exiles, so I just want you to know that. And fourthly, to the self, do you feel any kind of link to sources, either external or internal, which help you chart your way? Make the critical choices in your life. Serve to deepen your journey. Give you a sense of fulfillment, even in the face of conflict, even in the face of failure. And what is that source? You call it instinct or intuition or the self, or what do you call it? What, if anything, is your compass? And do you remember to consult it? So you can see here, obviously, the question that Jung asked a century ago can't be ignored. What is my myth? There are many, to be honest, many. But generally speaking, the myth he talked about was the individuation process. And by that he meant not individualism, but in some way finding something within us that's worthy of genuine service. If we don't, we'll be serving complexes or slave drivers in the outer world. That's the only choice. We're always in service to something. And you better figure out what it is. Because if it's not something worthy of the soul, if it's not something that brings value into your life, it's going to be something trivializing and bankrupting spiritually in the long run. An awful lot of people think it's about making more money. And we have to make money to pay for our homes and our families and so forth. No one's naive about that. I work every day. But I think you know the difference. I don't have to spell that out. And are we served by our driving stories, our complexes? Are we served by our ancestral influences or impeded by them? Are we able to sort through the extraordinary cacophonous assault from the external world that beats upon us every day and find those voices and insights that help us grow? Because it's a time of exploding information that's of great value, an enormous amount of chaff and distraction too, of course. Now, one example of a postmodern like us who I think understood this task was the poet Stanley Kunitz. And this was a poem written about when he was 95, and he was still writing when he passed away about 102 or 3, because he was trying to explore and summarize the nature of his journey, its defeats, its losses, and yet some ineluctable force within him seeking to continue the journey. And it's simply called the layers. And by layers, he means the different levels at which our journey occurs at all times. The basic task of depth psychology is to be mindful of and to be, at some point, trying to read the presence of the invisible world as it informs and drives the visible world, as it does in every moment of our lives. So I think Kunitz, as a poet, is someone who, in some way, was able to go back and forth between those worlds. This is the layers. I've walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I'm not who I was, though some principle of being abides from which I struggle not to stray. When I look behind, as I'm compelled to look before I gather strength to proceed on my journey, I see the milestones dwindling toward the horizon and the slow fires trailing from the abandoned campsites over which scavenger angels wheel on heavy wings. Oh, I have made myself a tribe out of my true affections, and my tribe is scattered. How shall the heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? In a rising wind, the manic dust of my friends, those who fell along the way, bitterly stings my face. Yet I turn exulting somewhat with my will intact to go, wherever I need to go, and every stone on the road is precious to me. In my darkest night, when the moon was covered and I roamed through wreckage, a nimbless clouded voice directed me, live in the layers, not on the litter. Though I lack the art to decipher it, no doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written, for I am not yet done with my changes. Well, all this brings us back to the question Jung asked, what is my myth? And as I said, the responsibility for that has shifted to the shoulders of the individual. That is both a huge privilege and an enormous, terrifying experience at the same time. You realize, given the distractions in this world out there, and the flight from that responsibility out there, the infantility of our culture, you realize how terrifying that prospect really is. And how difficult it is to be a grown-up, psychologically speaking. To be a grown-up means I am wholly responsible for my story and for my decisions and their consequences. It sounds so simple. It's such a challenge. Now, addressing this responsibility is our greatest burden and our greatest gift, addressed in some way in the words of Christopher Fry back in the 40s. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to face us everywhere, never to leave us till we take the longest stride of soul we ever took, because affairs are now soul-sized. Now, the acceptance of that task, I think, provides our life with greater depth, gravitas, purpose, and dignity. So let's take a 10, 12-minute break, stretch, get some refreshment. We'll come back for your thoughts, comments, protests. Thank you.